This is the story of the John Gay family who came to America. My name is Denise Gay Civic, and I am the sixth great-granddaughter of John Gay. I will be your narrator, and this is our story. My presentation contains the research done by my uncle, Don Gay, of the Pastor Gay lineage of Augusta, Virginia. Don began his book entitled A Family Named Gay by discussing the Gay family origin in Normandy, France. According to the book, they might have dwelled in the Channel Islands off the coast of France before coming to England and then to Ireland. He had stories of our family starting in Pennsylvania, but no written connection back to the old countries, except a belief that John Gay, one of the Pennsylvania ancestors, was born in Northern Ireland, in the Ulster province. It is not established how this John Gay came to be born in Ireland around 1675, or indeed who his actual father was. So it is my purpose today to put forward a research effort that will further what my Uncle Don started. I now believe our family traces back to Devon, England, in the 13th century. We will later discuss their departure to Ireland, and finally how they came to be in early America before the Revolutionary War. We start with the Legay surname. It is thought to have come from a village in France. It was pronounced either Guy in France or Guy later in England. The Guy phonetic name carried on for many generations in Scotland, England, and Ireland. The name retained the Guy pronunciation even on the American frontier. It was later widely adopted as Gay from the literal spelling. For our purposes going forward in this presentation, we will pronounce the name Gay. The Gay surname appears in England shortly after the Norman conquest in 1066. The earliest record in England is of an Oswald Legay in Surrey, born in 1166. I could not find that he was our direct ancestor. However, Adam Legay, who was born in 1273 in Oxfordshire, is a direct ancestor in our lineage. The theme of the later English family seems to be their staunch devotion to being Protestant. We will tell how they fought for it, and how they fled from persecution, and how they eventually overcame it. However, this was not always the case. The line also traces back to a John Gay or Guy, who was from Goldsworthy, Devon, England, born around 1378. He was definitely a Catholic, along with his family. The village sat in close proximity to modern-day Clyde St. George in Devon. The Goldsworthy family crypt is located there in the church cathedral. For purposes of the story, we will talk about the Presbyterian movement, which also began around the 16th century in Scotland and France. This was 300 years later. The Gay family joined this movement at some further point. That would have posed a great danger to them, due to King Henry VIII founding the Church of England in 1534, and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, carried it on until 1603, when she died. They were famous for demanding fealty both to the crown and to the new church, and they imprisoned anyone who opposed them, often in the Tower of London, and often they were beheaded. The next notable member of the family was Anthony Gay, the mayor of Barnstaple, Devon, England, around 1600. The family was still Catholic at this time. He married Alice Bapel, whose father, Richard Bapel, was appointed to the Spanish Company in England. Both families were considered wealthy merchants due to their mercantile trading throughout Europe. A cousin to the line was John Gay, an English poet who rose to fame for writing The Beggar's Opera. He was born in late 1600s in Devon, and his portrait hangs in the National Galleries in Scotland. He is buried in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London. Our family saga takes a turn here, as they chose to become Presbyterian. Anthony's son William was also born in Devon. His wife Elizabeth Coffin was born and died in Devon as well. They had 2 children, Elizabeth, born in 1649, and William, born in 1653, both in Devon. After Elizabeth's death, William Gay Sr. and the 2 children left England for Ireland. The children grew up in Northern Ireland in the area around Derry. This was close to the time when King James of Scotland came to the English throne. He was a Catholic. This would have posed a great problem for the Protestants. So Dr. William Gay Jr., born in 1653, became a Presbyterian minister in Ireland. He married Elizabeth Adams, born in Northern Ireland, and they had 10 children. The Rockbridge, Virginia journals report that our Dr. William Gay fought in the siege of Londonderry in 1689. It is not written if his sons John and Charles also fought. They would have been 14 and 10 at that time. But it is very easy to guess that their family, and even entire families, situated in Derry, fought for their lives and for their religious freedom. The famous siege lasted around 105 days. I can't imagine. King James could not breach the outer walls or storm the gate, so they tried to starve the rebellious citizens. As this situation became more and more desperate, and as they were running out of food and supplies, William of Orange saved the day by sending ships to relieve Derry, and the Williamites won the day. There are still celebrations of this event in Northern Ireland every year to remember the heroes. Here is another story shared by the Kincaid family of Augusta, Virginia. The ancestors of my grandparents were Scotch people. They left Scotland after the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and they went to Ireland, settling in the northern part. My grandmother's people were about 4 miles out from Derry. They were devoted Presbyterians, and they did not side with either of the extreme parties in that day. King William represented their ideas, and they held him in highest admiration. I can well remember a little boy of 10 years of age, standing by my grandmother and being delighted to listen to her give the history of the memorable siege, which she had heard from the lips of her mother, whose father was in the siege. Not a great while after this, the ancestors emigrated to the United States. They first came to Pennsylvania, soon after moved to Virginia to the county of Augusta. My grandfather, William Kincaid, born in 1736, and my grandmother, Eleanor Guy, who was 4 years younger than he was, are our ancestors. The man who fought in the siege of Londonderry was our own Dr. William Gay. A note concerning that story. While our family did come from England, the Irish contingent of the family married into many Scottish families. The Protestant traffic between Scotland and Ireland is documented by many scholars. Ulster was a hotbed of Protestant activity in those years and in the following years. Some of the Irish Gay brothers had children baptized in Scotland, and I found their baptismal records. There is a stronghold of the Gay family traced back to Fife, Scotland, which makes it probable that there are cousins of this line there as well. Also, the Kincaid family had strongholds in Scotland before coming into Ireland. The Eleanor Gay in this story will receive further attention in our Virginia section of the history. Her account and her great-grandfather's account were used for the connection here only of the family. There is a Rockbridge, Virginia document which states that Dr. William Gay obtained 61-year leases in Londonderry around 1670 after the siege ended. When those leases ran out, it seems clear that they all decided to set sail for America, probably for better opportunity. The leases reportedly could not be renewed at that time, and America offered a lot of free land also at that time. This would have been around 1730, during the Great Migration from Ireland, which started in 1720 and ended in 1740. As our family story relates, our immigrants left Ireland for Pennsylvania. Some of the children of Dr. William and Elizabeth stayed in Pennsylvania. This is the case and the first appearance of our direct ancestor, our sixth great-grandfather John Gay, who was born 1675 in Ulster, Ireland, and he died around 1742 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His wife was Isabel Davidson, born in Stirling, Scotland, who came over to America with John, and who died around the same period in the 1740s in Pennsylvania. Some of John's sons stayed in Pennsylvania with their parents. However, Henry and John, other sons, settled alongside Dr. William, their cousins, and his family down the river. Samuel, our direct ancestor, had a son, William, who later joined them. He is our fourth great-grandfather. So Dr. William, Elizabeth, 5 of the sons, 1 daughter, and their cousins decided to find more virgin territory. This route might have begun on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania and traveled to the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia side. This does seem the most likely, as river travel was the norm back then. It appears from other land documents that Dr. William purchased his 400 acres in Rockbridge, Virginia without any help from a family member. This was very unusual in those times, because many immigrant families came to America as indentured servants in exchange for working off their passage, and their hopes were that they could purchase land somewhere in the future. This doesn't seem to be the case of this gay family. They seem to be able to easily acquire land throughout these decades in Europe and into America. Our family joined religious freedom in the New World. However, 18th century Virginia had many other battles in store for them. They cleared the land, they built houses, they battled disease, they dealt with high infant mortality rates, and most of all they contended with the Indian wars, so numerous in those times, such as the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War. Tobacco farming was the leading industry in Tidewater, Virginia, and the Virginians there shipped tobacco to England off plantations. However, this does not seem to be the case in northwest Virginia, where our ancestors settled. The land was very rugged and uncleared. We now continue with our side of the Gay family in Virginia. Dr. William died in 1700 and Elizabeth died in 1737, both in Augusta County, Virginia. Their sons and their Pennsylvania cousins retained the land they purchased until the Indian Wars became too much. Dr. William had a granddaughter named Eleanor Gay Kincaid, who was abducted by the Indians with her 3 children. William Gay, our 4th great-grandfather, the son of Samuel, was killed during an Indian raid, and his son William was orphaned and raised by relatives. This is the story of Eleanor Gay Kincaid. During Pontiac's War, the home of William Kincaid was raided by the Indians, and Mrs. Eleanor Gay Kincaid and her 3 small children were carried into captivity. The children were Margaret, 7 years, Andrew, 4, and Isabella, 2. Margaret, the eldest daughter, died on the trail, and Andrew was brutally slain by the Indians. Eleanor was adopted into an Indian family, and her small daughter Isabella was taken from her, and she saw her no more during their captivity. In October 1765, about a year and a half later, Colonel Henry Bouquet, with a force augmented by Virginia volunteers, marched from Fort Pitt to the Muskingum River in Ohio. There he was met by Indian chiefs who had 18 white captives that they were suing for peace. But Bouquet demanded the return of all prisoners, so he held several of these principal chiefs as hostages, and he marched into the heart of the Indian country. Here he waited until some 200 captives had been surrendered. Then he made peace with the Indian tribes, but he still remembered that there were 100 more prisoners held. In the Virginia troops was William Kincaid, and he and his wife Eleanor were happily reunited. But they tarried with the troops until they could find their daughter Isabella. Mrs. Kincaid had also given birth to a son in her captivity, and she named him Andrew for the son who was killed on the trail. Later, when she was the mother of another daughter, she named the child Margaret for the daughter who died on the tragic trek. Finally, in a group of returned prisoners, they saw a little girl clinging to the buckskin skirt of an old squaw, and they recognized her as their daughter. Eleanor was able to identify her by certain scars on her foot, made by a bleeding process in her infancy. The child was indeed Virginia Isabella, who later became the wife of Andrew Hamilton, Jr. of the Augusta calf pasture. Moving on with our story. William Gay, the orphan, born 1756 in Augusta County, moved to Tennessee along with other relatives in the 1780s. The cousins had decided to branch out between Tennessee and Kentucky. The Kentucky family started to breed horses. The Tennessee family introduced improved livestock breeding to Botatort in Blount County. Our William Gay married Mary Craig, and they had several children. When Mary died, he then married Elizabeth Wood around 1817. This was a very common practice to remarry, and many families and their fathers married over and over in these times. Their son, John Wood Gay, our second great-grandfather, was born 1818 in Blount County. As far as we know, our family was still farming during the time of John Wood Gay. He married Elizabeth Branham around 1838 in Blount County, Tennessee. They had 7 children, among them Aaron Willoughby, who was born in 1850 in Scottsboro, Alabama. It was a tradition of the Scotch-Irish families to marry and rename children the same name as their ancestors, and if their spouse died, they married and renamed their children after their Scotch ancestors. This was to continue the line because there was a high infant mortality rate in those days. Moving on with the story, there is no indication of why this family relocated to Alabama, but all the children were born there. It does seem that they moved shortly after their marriage. John Wood and Elizabeth Gay both died in Alabama in the first decade of 1900. Aaron Willoughby Gay, our great-grandfather, was born in Alabama in 1850, and he ended up in James River, Marion, Arkansas before 1875. He and his wife, Sarah Jane Day, and their first 2 children appear in the 1880 census in Arkansas. His occupation is again listed as farmer on that census. Aaron W. and Sarah Jane had 10 children, 8 boys and 2 daughters, all born around Kingdon Springs. The faith, which was their forefathers' faith, and which they carried down, is evident in some of the names of the sons, such as Enoch Gideon Gay, a great Bible name if I ever heard one. Their last son was named James Henry Lafayette Gay, who was born in 96, and who happens to be my grandfather. He married Esther Clark in 1915 in Marion County. A little historical side note. I was also able to trace the family of Esther back to William Clark, who was her fourth great-grandfather. Esther was directly related to William Clark and more distantly related to Meriwether Lewis, who were the most famous early American explorers. James H.L. Gay was famously known in our family as Fate Gay. I never knew his full name until I started researching the family, as he was always called Fate. Fate and Esther had one girl who died at infancy, Lena Gay, in 1916. They then had Don Wade in 1918, J.D. in 1920, both my uncles, Wanda Corinne in 1923, my aunt, and Delbert Jean Gay in 1930, who is my father. The family moved to Morris, Oklahoma when Don was only 3 years old in 1921. There are many stories about this generation, and here I'm going to share just a few of them. One of my favorite stories is about the Gay Family Orchestra in Morris, Oklahoma. They were known as the Gay Ramblers. Fate Gay, my grandfather, played the fiddle. Don, my uncle, played the banjo. J.D., my uncle, played the guitar. Elmer Gay, who was Fate's nephew, lived in Oklahoma in Tulsa, and he was the son of Enoch Gideon Gay. The band could be heard on station WTUL in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1930s. I learned that my Aunt Wanda grew up playing piano, and I certainly knew my dad learned music on that old Gibson banjo they had. There was another musical trio in our family. Riley Homer Burns was the husband of Effie Clark, who was Esther Clark's sister, our grandmother. He and his 2 daughters formed a family group named the Burns Trio, and they appeared many places and were also on weekly radio in Arkansas, and later they moved to Missouri. I can remember family reunions in Missouri where all the Gay family cousins got up on stage and took turns singing and playing, and even dancing. It was always the best down-home jamboree. After my grandparents retired back to Yellville, Arkansas, what a beautiful place it was. We went to see them a few times. By then, my Papa Fate was white-headed. He always smoked a pipe, and he was very quiet. My grandmother Esther, who we called Nina, was hard-working. She cooked pies and breads every day and kept a spotless house. I remember getting up at 4 a.m. just to see her make her famous cherry pineapple cobbler, which my dad loved so very much. I still remember her ham, her wonderful homemade rolls, and her pies so many years later. Their son, Don Wade, was a brilliant scientist, and he was a chemist who was called to work on the secret Manhattan Project in World War II under J. Robert Oppenheimer. If you don't know this story, please look it up. It's amazing. He went on after the war to work for DuPont in Pennsylvania. He invented the nylon process and became known as Mr. Nylon. J.D. was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy in World War II and in Korea. His family moved to California in the late 40s, and then back to Oklahoma when he retired in 1963. My father, Delbert Gay, was too young for the war. He decided to put his effort into sports, and he loved the game of baseball. He graduated high school in Oklahoma and started to play in the minor leagues for several years. I was able to find many of his stats in the Oklahoma newspapers, and his strength was hitting. His position was catcher, but he was really known for his powerhouse bats. He often led the league. He eventually had to give up professional baseball after he married my mother, Charlene Susie Faye Wyatt, in Oklahoma in 1950. One of the funny stories is my father and mother getting married during an inning break at a baseball game in 1950. The baseball players formed an arch with their baseball bats, and my mother walked through it in her wedding dress. My father was waiting at home plate for her. They got married, and then my father finished out the ball game. The article in the Seminole paper said that ball players on the team who married in this way got free household items from the local sponsors. Is that why? They were so practical in those days. Finally, we come to the present generation of the Gay family. We are the baby boomers born in the 50s, who are scattered over the United States, in places like Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, California, Kansas, New Mexico, and many others. Our stories are not finished yet, but they will be amazing as well. I wrote this presentation to remind all of us, no matter where we live, of our heritage to keep alive for future generations. It is my sincere hope that one of them will find this and continue the story as new information becomes more available. That will also keep the current generation closer to us and to their ancestors. My presentation is given in loving memory of everyone who went before us and on whose shoulders we stand.